led the charge for funding for $1.18 million to support the expansion of cameras outside of school zones to address the needs of communities that are clamoring for this kind of technology.
Well, that's Seattle City Council Transportation Committee Chair Rob Saka once again voicing full support for an expansion of traffic safety cameras in the city. So how many parts of the city are going to get these new cameras? What's the rollout of this program going to look like? Plus, some new budget concerns cropping up for Seattle and a sobering report on gun violence, too. All this and a whole lot more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine. I am joined by my co-host, David Croman, writer for the Seattle Times. And David, I check in with you here. The Week 1 baseball heat check. Mariners not hitting all that great. Decent pitching, aside from one bad outing. May I use the phrase, not surprised, or what would best describe your feelings right now?
Yeah, typical Mariners April baseball.
Yeah, we still got to wake up in many different ways to what this is going to be about. But yes, probably not all that surprising. Thank you, David, for being here with me. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to our show patrons. Kara just jumped on board a short while ago. Thank you, Kara. I sent Kara a Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal a short while ago. One of the many perks for becoming a patron. All about that merch. We also answer your questions on the show and also keep an eye out for Patrons First content too. So please do get on board. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and pledge your support. Also, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Okay, heads up, people. 19 new school safety zone cameras are coming to a neighborhood near you later this year. This from a meeting of the council's Transportation Committee this week, and also thanks in part to changes in the state law recently that allow for this kind of speed detection technology to be put in place all around the city. David, we've been talking about this automated technology before. The city says it's really been working. These types of cameras have been used in Seattle for nearly 20 years, and the data shows 90% of the people who receive a citation with one of these do not receive another citation when they roll through these cameras. In school zones that have a safety camera, the total crashes across all times of day have gone down by 50%. But I guess, David, the challenge now is to expand this beyond school safety zones. It looks like all the council members are on board to do this, to slow down street racing, for example. What's happening next with this?
Yeah, I mean, there has been kind of ongoing support for this in a pretty broad sense for a few years now, really. The question is just actually getting them out into the streets, and that has proven to be the more difficult piece of this, because again, politically speaking, this hasn't been particularly contentious. I
was going to say the prior council in 2023 was talking about this before all the new members came on board.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Councilmember Morales and Peterson both kind of teaming up on this issue. People who are not always working together.
Right.
But again, it's just the question of actually getting these out, installing them. It's kind of an expensive, slow process. And then eventually, once they're up, making sure there's people to review the tickets. That was, I think they've kind of solved that problem. But for a while, that was an issue with traffic cameras, is the police department didn't have a big enough unit to actually go through the tickets. So a lot of them were just expiring without ever being followed up on. I think we've talked about this before. I think traffic cameras tick a lot of boxes, which is,
right.
We know that roads are really unsafe right now. A lot of people are dying. We also know that there's not a lot of enforcement capacity in police departments, particularly around traffic. I don't know what the numbers are now, but the Seattle Police Department for a while had basically just stopped doing any traffic enforcement. Right. And then, there's this other piece of people who don't want to have face-to-face interactions with police. All of those people see value in traffic cameras. There are, of course, surveillance concerns that I think crop up, but the political momentum is firmly in favor of these kinds of automatic cameras.
Yeah, and just in touching on that police piece, it sounds like the city has figured out some ways to make this happen such that non-sworn officers could be the people actually reviewing this material. So we're talking about an enforcement piece that has been beefed up with some help from these recently passed state laws. I did want to go further down this path here, David, in terms of when and where these cameras are expanded out into different neighborhoods, because I heard this issue brought up a few times in this committee meeting, the idea of equity as to where these cameras are going to be placed. We're talking about an equity toolkit. You may have heard that phrase a few times, folks. That phrase really didn't exist 20 years ago when this technology was first rolled out. So I just kind of saw that as a potential piece here, David. How do you see that consideration of equity impacting where we're going to see more of these cameras? Is there a concern some areas might be over-cameraed, if that's a word?
I think there's two ways you could look at this. I mean, there's the over-cameraed viewpoint, as you mentioned, which is, there are legitimate concerns about over-surveilling, communities with a higher proportion of people of color and maybe lower incomes. Of course, that stands out. You're putting more cameras in their neighborhoods. I'm sure people will have some concern about that. The other piece, though, that can be looked at is those neighborhoods people are far more likely to be the victims of crashes and traffic deaths. The disproportionate number of pedestrian deaths are in kind of Rainier Valley area.
Right.
There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, a lot of it has to do with where we built our roads and the busiest roads and where people can afford or have been forced in some cases to live. And so from that perspective, you could actually also make the argument that these neighborhoods could benefit more from these surveillance or automated traffic devices than some other neighborhoods. So there's kind of two ways to weigh the equity piece to this, I think.
I would agree with you there. I'm interested to see this because I think a lot of neighborhoods are calling out for these things. Areas like Rainier Avenue South, I know there's been a lot of call for it in other neighborhoods too. I'm interested to see how this rollout goes. But what we're going to see here, folks, is really the start will be with these school safety areas. So 19 of those going in place by the end of this year. And then at the start of next year, it sounds like more of these conversations about the larger issue of where more of these speed cameras might be going in place. All right, I wanted to talk about another big budget issue with you here, David. Cropped up for the council last week, still playing out right now. This is in regard to the Jumpstart tax, the payroll tax on big businesses. We've talked about this on the podcast too. Saved the city last year. It came in with $42 million more than expected. Really worked as a short-term fix for a major budget gap here. But this year, Seattle's Office of Economic and Revenue Forecast says Jumpstart looks like it's going to have $47 million less than what was projected. So a bit of a seesaw here. I was interested in this, David, because the mayor put out a statement right after this news came out, and he appeared to walk a very fine line, pointed out, okay, this is a very volatile fund, very true, has a lot of ties to the stock market. He said the decrease could be tied to major employers moving jobs out of Seattle. Harrell said in his statement he wants large corporations to pay their fair share, but also recognizes that businesses are looking at their bottom line. I was just looking at this, David, and trying to figure out what is the right way for the mayor and the city to navigate this. Yes, this is a newer tax, but this is the first drop in Jumpstart revenue projections that the city's ever seen.
Yeah, that statement was sort of an everything bagel statement, kind of trying to walk all political lines at once.
Yes.
The first thing would be to say it is important to point out that the amount of money that Jumpstart brought in 2024 was still higher than the amount it brought in 2023. So it is still going up. It's just the forecasts.
It's not on with the projections. Okay.
The projections were a little off. But, in practical terms, the projections are kind of what matters when it comes to actually budgeting. And the reality was that this current budget was built around an assumption about what they would have for the Jumpstart tax now that they don't have it. I think the mayor's office is essentially waiting for the April forecast in hopes that maybe it shows something more optimistic. If it doesn't, which I don't see any reason it would necessarily, then I think they're going to have to make some tough decisions like this year. I don't think this is a problem to be solved next year or for next year's budget. And, I'll point out that people who pushed for this tax are now kind of saying, hey, this is why we wanted this to be a kind of earmarked funding source, that this is why it was risky to use this as a general fund prop up, because, if this was just to fund affordable housing, if there's a dip in the forecast, that's unfortunate. Maybe you don't be able to build as much affordable housing, but it would not have necessarily led to layoffs as this could possibly.
Yeah, and I'll keep going down that path with you here, David, because Katie Wilson has been talking exactly about what you're saying here. She, the front runner, is Harrell's opponent this fall in his re-election bid. Plus, I should point out, the Metro Chamber of Commerce came out with some criticism for the city over this report with the Jumpstart shortfall. I'm not going to say that those two are on the same side, but both definitely share concerns over the volatility of this tax, and it's not often you see Wilson and the chamber exactly on the same page here. I guess I was just looking at this. Is this issue of Jumpstart, the budget in a larger sense, is that going to be an election challenge for Bruce Harrell this fall? How do you look at that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think It could be insofar as it's a tough issue that he has to deal with in an election year. I think, again, he had managed to sort of solve the budget problem in a kind of temporary way without needing to do anything that looked too kind of aggressive, I suppose. There was a hiring freeze, but that's much easier to do than actually firing people who are on the payroll right now. So insofar as it could be a budget issue, he doesn't, I'm sure doesn't want to be the person laying people off going into an election season.
Right.
And one of his strongest opponents, Katie Wilson, was an architect of the Jumpstart tax and had been very clear from the start that it should not be used for the general fund. And so she's going to, I'm sure, bring that up. The salience of that argument, I'm not sure. We'll see, but it's certainly going to be something he has to contend with.
Last piece on this, just in looking at it, these ideas like Jumpstart, I know the wealth tax is getting a lot of back and forth in Olympia right now. They're relatively new taxes for the state of Washington because the Supreme Court only recently ruled that this type of tax can exist. It's not an income tax, according to the state Supreme Court. But in looking at that, I think there are some challenges with it, especially when it comes to collecting it. And I think that's a piece of this that maybe some legislators didn't quite understand. What sort of loopholes are different employers potentially going to go through to move jobs out of the city? I feel like there's a lot of unknown still surrounding this tax because it's so new. Just the matter of collecting it seems like a real unknown to me in some ways. Yeah,
that's right. And I think that's made especially more complicated because of, how easy remote work is these days. Yeah. You tell some of your higher up people, like, hey, you're just going to work 2 days a week in our Bellevue office or whatever it is. I think there's some of that happening. There's data that shows that, Amazon is growing in Bellevue, but shrinking in Amazon. It's impossible to tie that to any one specific thing. And a piece, I don't know if lawmakers have the same kind of trouble, but a piece for me as a reporter that's really difficult is the lack of transparency around who is actually paying this tax. We have guesses. We know that the largest share is Amazon and, Expedia, for example, and some other. I think I heard at one point that it was like 15 companies make up like 70% of the tax.
Sure, makes sense.
500 companies still pay the tax. And so we don't know who those 500 companies are. So it's really hard to, with the exception of Amazon and some of these big companies, it's really hard to kind of figure out where those tax dollars are going. I mean, as one person pointed out, it could be a large law firm or whatever that's subject to this tax. We don't know which law firms, though, or if they're moving people to Washington, D.C., because there is no kind of public list about who is actually paying this tax. So that's a frustration that I have as a reporter.
Definitely. Yeah, this has been something that's been really interesting to sort through over the past several years. Thank you for that, David. All right, well, up next, a challenging report about gun violence coming out from the city auditor. What is it saying about trends in gun violence in Seattle? And what's the city doing about some of these alarming numbers? That's coming up next on Now Hear This. Well, at the end of last week, the Seattle City Council heard a report about gun violence from the city auditor's office that may confirm what you are already experiencing in your neighborhood. Between 2013 and 2024, reports of shots fired increased by 194%. Non-fatal injuries were up 150%. Fatal shootings went up 220%. One major challenge emerging with this trend, the auditor said, is a lack of communication between different city agencies that might help solve this problem. An issue Councilmember Mark Solomon brought up on the dais.
That cooperation between departments, between agencies, that absolutely needs to happen because it ain't just a police issue. It ain't just a parks issue. It ain't just an SDOT issue or a city light issue. It's a Seattle issue.
David, just following up on this, it seems that things became especially bad after the pandemic. Some of the data there, between 20 and 24, shots fired increased by 71%. Non-fatal shootings increased 58%. Fatal shootings increased 23%. I know I said a lot of numbers there. What do these numbers say to you, what the auditor was reporting on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's not been a great couple of years. I think it has not been a great couple of years nationally. I still think the role of the pandemic has been kind of underappreciated in some ways. I mean, obviously, there are big things that happened in 2020. There was the pandemic and the protests and the kind of new calls for defunding the police. And I think there are arguments to be made about both of those effects. But, for my money, it's just you put a lot of people at ends without a lot of support systems and places to go or places to be. It's, statistically, we know that summers are more dangerous times the rest of the year because people don't have as much to do, and that's when violence happens. And I think the pandemic was basically, it made it like summer all the time. There's just not a lot of support systems or places for people to go. And so you see this jump in crime. There's so much nuance to it, and I'm sure there will be disputes. The fact that the police department was bleeding staff as much as it was, it's hard to draw a direct correlation there, but certainly worth looking at. And so, the point about being better, more communicative, that seems to me to a lot of times be the takeaway of these audits is people are bad at talking to each other. And so, it doesn't surprise me. It's not like I said, I feel like we hear that frequently when talking about a problem that is going unaddressed by a large city bureaucracy.
Oh, for sure. And this got a little bit chippy, I thought, during this meeting because the city auditor was basically saying city agencies aren't working together on the problem of gun violence. But Deputy Mayor Tiffany Washington was there at this hearing last week and was saying maybe there's been some miscommunication between the mayor's office and the city auditor that led to these findings. She said the city has been doing a lot of work on this in terms of gun violence prevention over the past year plus. Help me out with that communication issue because I'm trying to figure out where this goes. There was some talk even of CARE, the Community Assisted Response and Engagement, Public Safety Department, maybe being an interlocutor there and trying to help out with some of this communication. Where do you see that communication piece going here?
Yeah, I don't have a great idea of what it looks like now.
Yeah, good. I don't know if it really exists for that matter.
I think the idea is, you have, right now you've got these sort of different factions that think about gun violence in different ways. The police department sees it as a crime. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of the violence prevention programs see an opportunity for kind of intervention to reduce retaliation or whatever it might be. But, sort of different viewpoints into the same crime. And I think the idea that they're saying is, those people all need to be in the same room together talking. Again, I don't. Maybe that's happening now already. I don't have a great sense of how much it is. The auditors seem to think it wasn't happening enough as it could be, but I suppose maybe they're advocating for kind of an office of gun violence or something like that, where all these people get together and can kind of go over what's happened the night before. But, I don't know exactly what that ends up looking like.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting twist there. I'll be very interested to see how CARE gets involved with that because that's an agency that the city had a resolution this week talking about some of the different alternative ways it's dealing with public safety. And CARE's, the name of CARE, that department came up quite a bit. So we'll see what happens in that role there. I did want to touch on another issue from late last week, David. The city council was discussing how it's going to incorporate new state directives on how and where to increase urban density. And this would happen before its grand comprehensive plan is settled, which with a number of legal challenges could be a few months. We discussed this a number of times on the podcast, David. House Bill 1110, this missing middle housing piece that the state has been pushing forward, needs to be in place in cities around the state by June of this year. You wrote about this recently, though, David, in the Times, this larger concept of the state sort of driving the train when it comes to where growth should be happening in our cities. It isn't something a lot of city leaders in Seattle are all that happy about. What's going on with this?
Yeah, it struck me as an interesting time because, I have been around long enough to remember the last kind of big housing fight what happened at the city level, which really was 2015. At the time, the state was not anywhere on anybody's radar. And so it was very much a purely city-based fight. And all the housing lobbyists were kind of focused on Seattle.
Yeah. Is this mandatory housing affordability, MHA, that stuff?
Yeah, and the HALA committee,
Yes.
Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, as I think.
Well played. Yep.
And, at the time, it just, there was so much kind of pressure on Seattle. And then the backlash really got to people at the time. And so some certain policies that around, changing single family zones to allow duplexes or triplexes were dropped pretty quickly. So this struck me as the conversation we're in now is kind of the first time that local city officials in Seattle are having this housing conversation when they don't have as much control over this as they used to.
Yeah, right.
And, the reasons for that have a lot to do actually with that 2015 saga, which is basically all the housing advocates and lobbyists said, that was not worth our time and energy for what we thought was a modest change. We think that we're going to have more success at the state level, and they've turned out to be right. The thing, though, is, for people at the city level, like, I focused on particularly Councilmember Kathy Moore. Despite the nuance to their views, there is a sort of overriding friction, I suppose, that they are dealing with these policies that are coming down from the state. And they are the ones who are kind of the face of that at a level where they are kind of the most susceptible to public frustration and
Sure.
feedback from their constituents, and they're reacting to that. You can make an argument about what kind of the general public actually believes about housing and density, which polling suggests most people are actually fairly supportive. But the most vocal people in City Hall right now, I think, are the skeptics and opponents of some of the changes being proposed. And so that creates, I thought, was an interesting tension between the conversations happening at the state level and those happening at the city level.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that state perspective on this, because I've talked with Democrats like Jessica Bateman before from the 22nd District in Olympia. You talked to her for your piece here, too. And I think her point of view, and I read it in your piece, and I felt this, too, is that cities have been kind of getting in the way over the past 10 years. And I should point out, House Bill 1110 was a bipartisan measure. A lot of center-right politicians want to see more density, too. They want the business of developers and builders to thrive here. Where do you see this issue going in the future? Because I'm sure Seattle isn't the only city that feels like it's getting pushed around a little bit by the state. It's this kind of city versus state friction, and I wonder where that goes.
I think my prediction is it continues to be taken out of the hands of the city because the data is what it is, which is the state has not produced enough housing. And the reality on the ground is at local levels, the process for allowing new housing and allowing new housing to be built is quite slow and does not happen very often. And the reason I think it could continue, policies could continue to be driven at the state level is because of what you said, which is a lot of what we're talking about here. You can exclude rent control, which of course is very contentious and partisan. A lot of the stuff that Senator Bateman and other people at the state level are talking about is essentially getting rid of regulations and at the end of the day, a kind of free market approach to housing. And of course, Republicans are interested in that. They see the housing crisis as being one of supply and demand, and so are willing to work with Senator Bateman and Democrats on this. And so we've seen, even in this session, a bill that would basically make it so you can't mandate parking at buildings. Right. I think that passed 49-0. That it was not fought at all. A bill like that is not passing unanimously at the local level by any stretch of the imagination. And yet at the state level, there's broad support for it. So as Senator Bateman said to me, that the ship has sailed on local control over the housing policy debate.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting to watch that, though. On the flip side, I know the state has been talking also about trying to keep rents within keep those raises in rents within a reasonable level over year to year. So there's a lot of housing talk going on at the state level right now. And really, yeah, you're right. Cities like Seattle are feeling the effect of that very immediately. So I did want to talk about this coming up next with you here, David. Another housing issue as Seattle tries to get out of its own way in the process of building affordable housing. We'll tell you what the Land Use Committee has on its docket this week. Coming up on What's Next. So the Land Use Committee is taking on an issue this week to allow building permit applicants an additional 24-month extension. And this is for any projects vested to the 2015 or 2018 Seattle Building Code requirements. I know I'm going down a path here, but you got to hear this, folks. The city says 3,000 projects could be extended by this legislation if they can prove financing issues have slowed them down. The mayor's office says we got 15 projects, mostly located downtown, that could move forward if this legislation were to pass. David, we've been talking about trying to get rid of some red tape, etc. What do you make of what the council is trying to do here?
Yeah, it's a little in the weeds, and I haven't wrapped my head around it fully. But I think there has been some challenges with the abrupt change in interest rates, and financing has gotten more difficult. And so, I think that the hope is that you can speed these projects along that might be kind of caught in between two eras. And a lot of the reason that a lot of these new buildings are caught between, the time when there was low interest rates and now that there are higher interest rates is it just takes a really long time to get through the process. So
right. Yeah. A pandemic happened too, by the way. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that too. So most of these projects started, I'm sure, the process long before interest rates became what they are today, and yet they're kind of stuck with them. And so I think the hope is speed those things along, clear as much red tape away so they can actually get completed.
And let me go down a quick sidebar here with you, David, because your colleague Greg Kim wrote about a phenomenon recently in the Seattle Times. During the 2010s, Seattle lost more than 14,000 rental units considered affordable for the lowest income households. At the same time, it just so happens, our population of people without homes increased exponentially, and a lot of people from the tech world were moving here too. What struck you about what Greg wrote there, David? Seeing those numbers like that was a very stark realization for me.
We talk a lot about affordable housing. When we say affordable housing, I think a lot of times we mean subsidized housing, funded by the government. But the reality is the cities that are most accommodating to kind of working class, middle class, even lower middle class folks are the ones that have affordable housing, sort of quote, naturally affordable housing.
Right.
So affordable housing that exists because for a number of reasons, some places it's a bad thing, like Detroit, there's not enough people there anymore, or at least there for a period of time. Or because cities, you look at Austin, have built a huge amount of housing and have kind of kept up with that. And so I think Greg's piece did a good job of showing that as the city grew, the policy did not follow. So we were adding jobs, but we were not adding housing. And so you can talk as much as you want about subsidized public, affordable housing, but at the end of the day, that's not going to be able to make up for the lack of supply. Because when rich people move in, they're going to outbid people for every level of housing if there is not enough. And so you increase the general rates of how much housing costs, and suddenly you're in a position where there's not enough housing for not enough people and for so many people. And then it's a game of musical chairs. And the result of that is either people leave or, in the worst case scenario, people become homeless.
Yeah, and when bigger pocket developers come in too, that's another piece of it, potentially buying up these older properties that were naturally affordable and moving people out and fixing them up and charging higher rents. I think that was a dynamic that I saw in Greg's piece too. That's another story behind the story, I think, behind this too.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's an argument to be made that if there was the freedom to do more building in other places around the city, the market for developers to buy up those, quote, naturally affordable buildings and convert them is not quite what it was. Or if that does happen, you can be reasonably sure that there are, enough ADUs or duplexes or whatever triplexes being built in other neighborhoods that can be rented at a fairly low cost, and so I think, yes, developers converting these older housing units to something more expensive is part of the picture, but I don't know that it tells the entire sort of captures exactly the economic forces that led that developer to do that and why there is then no kind of backup option for the people who can't afford that place anymore.
Yeah, a lot of different policy pieces involved there. Thank you for bringing that up, David, and a great piece by Greg indeed. I do need to wrap up with you here, David, and I want to check in with you about the Uncle Sam billboard. I saw you posting about this. This, folks, is that billboard off of I-5 and Napavine down south in Lewis County. Has that very concerned-looking Uncle Sam figure on it with marquee letters next to it, almost like a old-time movie theater there. Has had a message about Ukraine on it for the past 4 years. Well, the land it's on is now for sale. And David, I did see you post about this. Do you see this sign living on with messages of political commentary, or what do you hope happens to it?
I don't have any hopes for it. I don't at the end of the day care what happens to it, because, this is properties move from one hand to the next. The next person can do whatever they want with it. I will say, though, separate from the messages inherent
which were pretty salty. Yeah, for sure.
Which were pretty salty. I always, I went to school in Portland, so I've done the I-5 drive many, many times. It's monotonous to me, and yet I always got a little entertainment of driving past that sign. I knew I was halfway to Portland. I got to see what the Uncle Sam billboard had to say. I usually laughed a little bit, and I've been disappointed that over the last 4 years it has not changed at all. And so whoever buys it next, I hope they do something creative with it. Be that, the exact sort of conservative leaning message.
Sure.
Not even leaning. Staunchly conservative messages.
right.
There now.
Right. Well, we'll see what the next message will be there. It'll be interesting to watch how that billboard changes. And thank you, David, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. Kara, here's looking at you. Thanks for jumping on board. If you are not a patron, why can't you be more like your sister, Kara? Please support the program. Pledges start at just $5 a month on Patreon. That would be greatly appreciated. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.